We're live, or recording anyway. Welcome everyone to Grab The Reins. It's Eric Wahlberg again. Thank you so much for joining me today. I think I have a really, really awesome individual and conversation to be had. So I'm really excited to have Marik Hazen on the podcast. Marik, how are you? And welcome to Grab The Reins.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Eric. Doing well, coming out of the holidays, and doing great.
So Marik, right now, you're the co-founder of Energia, which is a platform for the psychedelic space that covers a variety of different areas that I'm sure we'll dig into. But I do know previously, right, you've been working in a lot of kind of the, what do you call them, counterculture tech spaces and just things in sex rights, sex worker rights, and so on. So why don't you give just a brief introduction of yourself for the community so that they can have a good sense of where you're kind of coming from and how you kind of view things?
Yeah, definitely. So I've been doing a lot of different types of advocacy for quite some time, for more than a decade at this point. Have contributed to a lot of different movements, the disability rights movement, the interfaith movement. But around 5 years ago, started and just really had an opportunity to go and contribute to the sex worker rights movement, which kind of brought me on a long journey. And today, the personal narrative that I kind of have built for myself is that what I'm contributing to is counterculture advocacy, controversial rights, really just working specifically with stigmatized communities to understand how can stigmatized communities, stigmatized lifestyles have significantly more support politically, economically, socially, et cetera. And so contributed to the sex worker rights movement for several years, building tech there, contributed to the decentralized governance space for a bit of time as well. But really these last 2 years have been focused primarily on the psychedelics ecosystem, trying to work with community members to build up organizations and startups as we see this incredible flow of capital coming in.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm going to take those three core areas of like sex worker rights, decentralized governance, and then psychedelics. I think that those are kind of three awesome areas to flesh out. So first with the sex worker rights, I think it's having a huge moment, right? And I think that's taken particularly crystallized in the form of a company called OnlyFans, where I feel like that's really created like a seismic shift in the monetization of sex work. Though I'm not sure, because I have seen discourse where people like the definition of sex work becomes, it's actually something that people are really like, some people think it's really important to kind of delineate certain things because without like, if it's just a virtual experience versus like the physical kind of, physical experience of being a sex worker, that there's like enormous differences in that. But do you sense that as well, that kind of sex work just in the through things like OnlyFans and other like digitization and almost the securitization of like sexual content for the individual, and kind of what that might be portends for the future or the next maybe 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. Like, I'm a really big proponent of just moving sex worker rights in the right direction and just creating significantly more spaces for sexual liberty. I think, yeah, we're starting with the virtual world, but OnlyFans, everyone knows about. But I think that there's a lot of other I guess like in-person types of communities that don't necessarily revolve around sex workers particularly, but are significantly sexually liberated spaces. So there's a lot of sex parties that have popped up that cater much more to a more progressive crowd, to a crowd that is much more consent focused, to a crowd that is much more supportive of females leading in sexual engagement instead of males leading. So there's a lot of really interesting movements that are happening in person as well. But yeah, I think that the barrier to entry, you could say, to becoming a sex worker, the potential profits, the stigma attached to that are all decreasing. And so there's a lot more people entering. It's insane to me to be having these conversations, especially, I probably have between 40 and 60 meetings per week with folks just focused on the psychedelics ecosystem. And there's a good chunk of people, particularly females, who will, after I talk about having contributed to the sex worker rights movement, who will talk about being a sex worker themselves at some point. So it's actually an experience that so many more people have shared because they are able to just, get on camera and masturbate in front of it instead of having to go and find a co-star to be able to actually shoot with, and going through the more traditional means. And it's also more lucrative for a lot of, it's a necessary revenue stream for people. There's, the after advertisement came into the adult industry, it became significantly more difficult for adult performers to be able to make ends meet. And so most sex workers that I met in the adult space were also doing, we're also working in prostitution at the same time, and not just an adult, but also seeing clients in person. You need multiple revenue streams at this point, and OnlyFans is a really great opportunity for sex workers and individuals who are just kind of interested in that type of world to be able to participate.
Yeah.
I'm not as particularly sensitive to like the distinctions between, whether you're in person, whether you're virtual. I categorize everyone as a sex worker, but I know that there are people who are, and that's for them to use that vernacular. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of differing opinions on how to speak about that type of work, I guess.
So one of the things that I find very interesting, and why I've kind of, when I was doing research for this conversation, when you think about like what a counterculture is for, in many ways it's also for pointing out the issues with the dominant culture, right? And when you think about OnlyFans and the way it's been used by a very large sum of particularly women, but I've seen, I've seen, it is just predominantly women. It's not just, but just for, though it is more diverse, obviously, where they're often using it for paying their student loans. Like a very large number of them, like they'll talk about this openly. And I know that there's some websites that have kind of also been built out. I think Sugar Daddy University, I think, is the name of one of them. So, like, we have a student loan crisis, right? We have a generation of young people that are, indebted, and, in a consumer-based society that kind of precludes them from participating, and inequality, in general. And so it's interesting because it's this countercultural point, right? Or this counterculture that exists, and it points to like really core issues with the dominant culture. What do you, and maybe there's more there that like, I just focused on that one point because I saw it so like, and then there was also an article, I think in the New York Post recently, where a woman who was an EMS, driver, it was discovered that she had an OnlyFans, and became kind of this whole like front page news thing, but she just wasn't getting paid enough. And you talked about like the necessity for a diversified revenue stream. It's like, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and this EMS driver who's a front line in the battle against this, I was going to use the word result to, but that makes it sound like a negative thing. It's just our society, they have to, yeah. Like there's something, there's a necessity there. It's really pointing to issues in our dominant culture.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, like the amount of, you have to ask, like, when does this bubble burst? When do these things break? Because, I don't think people see just how like faith in money as a construct even is decreasing. Like these numbers are so ridiculous at this point. Like I have $300,000 of debt from undergrad and graduate school, right? And it's just like, does it really make sense? Like working on the startup, I work a part-time job as well to like bring in some cash just so I can make the minimum payments on my private loans because my federal loans didn't cover everything, right? Like, does it really make sense for me to be putting in like, $500 per month, which is a significant portion of my current income stream, into this when my interest on those loans, just interest, is like $25K per year? It's just insane. And so like, these numbers are too big, and there's a point where it's just everyone's going to stop. Like people are not going to trust that these numbers mean anything. And I think this is a really interesting point because we're losing trust and faith in many different parts of our society right now, in the news and politics, but the economy is another one. And, the exorbitant growth of different cryptocurrencies, all the way to, this immense debt, the ability that we're able to just print money and hand it out, like all of these things are going to add up. And I don't know, that's a really, I think, interesting question to ask of like, what's going to happen when people don't believe in currency or what it actually means. And it's like, well, everyone has 300,000, $500,000 of debt, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt from student loans. Is anything going to happen if we just like stop paying altogether? There was actually an idea that I had for a piece of technology back, 3 years ago, I would say, was a form of collective action technology. So I don't know exactly like how feasible this would be to implement. It was just like a very high level idea. But basically, if you were to take, some sort of payment platform and allow for your loans to be paid exclusively through that platform, right? So you hook up your bank account, that platform makes payments on your behalf, right? Let's say that you get 10% of the population on that platform. And basically the purpose of the platform is it keeps making loan payments until enough people join the platform that there's enough of a majority that it can just shut off payments. And that collectively everyone's stopping to pay, so that you're not the only person who's actually stopping to pay and then you're fucked, but everyone else is continuing to make payments. So like, I'm super interested in these types of like collective action type of technologies where it's like, this is ludicrous. Like clearly our political system is taking advantage or not serving us in the way that it needs to at this point in time. It's unable to make decisions democratically because there are too few people who are, educated, in my opinion, in this society to be able to really make good determinants of who can allow for ourselves to push forward. But that's a whole nother conversation. And so what does it mean then to allow for individuals to take collective action against government through technology types of platforms? And I think decentralized governance is a good foundation for that. But I think that there's also these like really interesting little mechanisms that you can have of people, continuing to do everything that they do until you get enough people on board to be able to make one big collective movement happen. So yeah.
I think that that's a fascinating, it's a much more proactive and I think optimistic take to what I was like a couple of months ago. I was tweeting and like a segment of things where I thought everyone should, because I'm just astonished by it's so shameless the way that they've set up the legal framework that regulates the student loan space. So the fact that it's the only form of debt that isn't discharged in bankruptcy is crazy, right? That's so shameless. And so I was okay, like people are getting $1,200 stimulus checks, and people are having their money. And it's like, also the fact that they will dock your social security if you enter that. And when I learned that, I was astonished, right? That's like such a cornerstone of the social contract as it exists in like the Rooseveltian welfare state, that I couldn't believe that we had done this to young people. It's like young people, society is supposed to be very protective of their young people. Like it's almost from an evolutionary psychological perspective, you would think that. And so I was thinking, people should just be moving their paychecks into cryptocurrencies, where and using decentralized wallets and all these things, where it's like, come find my money, like good luck finding my money, and docking, so on, and just kind of exiting. And I'm very interested, we'll talk about, if you think about like, I'm very interested in the concept of exit in total, because I think it's like the major narrative in the most generative corners of the world right now. Whether that's and you touched on it, it's like people are losing faith in the media. So then you have like Substack, exit mainstream media, go fuck yourself, right? Then you have like decentralized, governance that's taking form, and you have charter cities that people are exploring. And by the way, charter cities, I want to talk about it because I know if you listen to my podcast with Alpha Berry, that concept of creating enough collective leverage to then be able to do something is exactly the same methodology that a lot of them are thinking about. So I guess I feel like counterculture is also another term for like an exit of the predominant culture. I've said a bunch of things, Marik, and I rambled a little bit, but what do you think? I really like what you suggested about using a platform and using this collective action, because it is, maybe they're not mutually exclusive, but it seems to me to be a bit more of an optimistic take than just saying like, okay, like I'm just going to move my money, into cryptocurrency just so they can't get it, because it's a very individualistic action as opposed to a collective one.
Yeah, and the thing is like, and I think that this connects really well to a point that you mentioned of protecting young people, right? Like I think that that's fading from our societal values because we are becoming more individualist and, straying away from just community dynamics. And for me, why I'm so interested in kind of counterculture is, yes, I think that it allows for society to move in a better direction in many ways, but I think that it also prioritizes community in multiple different ways. First off, the four pillars for myself that I think about when I think about counterculture is like sex, sexual liberation, is right to self-governance, and that's like decentralized governance and all of these types of things. It's right to self-medicate in one way or another, so plant medicines, alternative medicines, things like that. And the last one is right to alternative community structures. I call it polyamory, but it can be talked about in many different ways. And I think that all of those different pillars, and there might be more that I just don't think about as regularly, but those are the four I think about quite often. They're super important for us to get to a point where we are more community minded. Psychedelics allow for us to connect with individuals in a really deep way. They allow for us to prioritize healing and self-healing, which allows for us to bind with, community individuals, process our own egos, push our egos aside for the collective well-being. Sex, I think that the amount of damage caused in society by sexual repression, even at this point, like everyone's talking about being sexually liberal, I just don't buy it. Like I think people are still extremely conservative in many ways, which makes a lot of sense because we don't have any really good infrastructure for educating youth on, proper sexual engagement. There's like even dance culture is like so sexually charged, sexual assault happens. I think it's like 1/3 of monogamous couples or couples living in the United States have physical violence present in their relationships. Like it's absolutely insane. The statistics behind like how ineffective a lot of these, current structures are that suppress us, create more tensions, and don't allow for us to actually prioritize building community in the process of all of this. So a bit of a rant, but I think like, we're finally in this really interesting period where I think we're seeing that these cultures are really necessary. I think what's going to be the really big issue is that we're trying to build all this infrastructure to leave the dominant culture, but I think we're not really educating people on how to interact with it in the best ways. Like we don't just need OnlyFans. We need, for all children to be educated on how to sexually engage with one another and be able to interact with OnlyFans. Our health classes need to be talking about pornography and OnlyFans and compensation for sex workers. And, if you want to become a sex worker, these are ways that you should be thinking about, payment structure for yourself when it comes to paying for the healthcare costs associated with creating pornography, especially when it's with another individual. These are all things that like literally you would never think to like teach in schools, but we're not even doing the very basics of that. Like when you go to your first dance, there's no rules of engagement that are shown there, right? But you go to like, if you grow up in a society outside of the US that has like a really prominent dancing culture, you grow up with parents that are also, dancing, they're dancing close to one another, whether that's a style of dance that's like more formal like salsa, or whether that's grinding. Grinding is like, I could give you a whole podcast on grinding, and like just I think it is one of the most unique and absolutely like eloquent and dynamic forms of dance, but we've reduced it to this extremely sexualized action because we don't have parents typically in the United States, especially if we're growing up in, white, Western-centric types of families that are showing us what it means to engage in that way. And also, there's no one really educating us on nonverbal ways of communication. And so we take all of that and we reduce it to like, enthusiastic, yes, that's consent, and that's the only thing that works. But you go to any dance culture, outside of the US, and there's significantly healthier dynamics, even when people are more sexually expressive, just because there's, they're constantly seeing how that's actually conducted and how you communicate nonverbally to be able to make sure that you can trust the people around you and you can trust yourself to be able to step into an engagement. So yeah.
So no, you cover a couple of things like that are amazing. Yeah, right. So first, America, unfortunately, I mean, it got the world to a certain point. I mean, I don't know however many hundreds of millions, billions of people have been lifted out of poverty and all these things through the mass introduction of markets and so on. But American society is unbelievably atomized. Like, and most Americans do not realize that. Like, they don't, like, because if you do live outside of the United States and other cultures, and it's atomized in so many dimensions, right? So it's like young people. There's an amazing article, I think it was in the Atlantic, about like how New York has become like a city of young people. Like there's like no children because it's like too expensive to have children here. Nobody wants to raise children here, and so it's really just a bunch of brunch places for people in their 20s and 30s who who have no intention of getting married or having children because they don't think it's not that marriage is like the only path. Just to say that like they like if there's older people looking down and saying like, oh, like look at how they live their life, like why don't they take these traditional paths? It's like they're priced out of those traditional paths in many ways. Like so they're like, for example, people do not engage with people of other age categories from them, like in America. It's unbelievable. I lived in Israel, and the older people also, like, they participate in the active of like the nightlife. Like they are an active participant in the nightlife. Like in the public sphere of the nightlife. I find that in, like, if you think about like New York City, or just maybe other American places, it seems like as you get older, the concept is basically that and maybe it's because of how we've centralized the house in wealth creation and a whole bunch of things, but it happens in each other's houses. Like you go to maybe you go to dinner, but like a lot of like the interaction is just, you're sequestered from, like, everyone is sequestered. So like the people in the middle age, like they're only hang out with people in middle age for the most part, right? And I just wonder, like, the first of all, the transmission of context and wisdom and all these things just gets completely disrupted there. But also, you talked about kind of dancing and dance culture and seeing older people engage in dance culture, and providing context and tradition and culture through that. There's no ability for that, in my mind, to occur in the United States. And we lose, like, almost in total, as a result of that relationship. The only thing gained is efficiency, as far as I can tell. I mean, and I'm not sure that we really want that. I don't know. Anything on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's efficiency in like one specific way, but I think it is, and I think we agree on this. I think that there's that wisdom being lost. Ultimately it's kind of like the efficiency of an antidepressant. Yes, like it hits the exact neuroreceptors you need to be able to give you, that specific chemical change so that for the next few hours you can be fine. But when you compare it to any sort of like, emotional freedom technique, when you compare it to even like acupuncture, any sort of alternative medicine, it's significantly less effective. I mean, even this was published recently. I was really lucky to be invited to the MDMA, basically the research that was done, the clinical trial results of MDMA therapy that was done by MAPS, one of the more prominent organizations in the psychedelics ecosystem. And this has been published already, so I'm allowed to speak about it. But basically, what they showed with that study is that not even giving people MDMA, just the form of therapy that they use for MDMA assisted therapy is already more effective than like Prozac or like all of these like different antidepressants. So just the therapy without even the compound is significantly better. And I think that there's so much nuance in the ways that we engage in being able to heal us for the long term that we're losing out on trying to gain this efficiency and trying to get this like fast paced, oh, I see the change, because we're just so like we're not patient anymore. And also there's just the further and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I actually think a lot of this disconnect and a lot of this individualism is formed as a result of significantly more economic prosperity, allowing for us to actually separate and be more individualist, but also not necessarily this there being a lack of respect for ancestry and lineage and cultural heritage in this pursuit of liberal, concrete, scientific solutions to all things. And I think that there's a loss of humility there. But the part that I'd really love to hear your thoughts on is, and something that I'm thinking about constantly, is just like, does us being in environments that are less dangerous, does us being more financially independent, do those types of things that ultimately give us more freedom to separate from our communities, do they actually make society and individuals unhealthier in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most poetic parallel that like to this is like what happened with respect to supply chains as a result of the coronavirus shock. Like when you realize that like that affluence and all that stuff, what allows for an atomized society to exist is supply chains, right? You know, because that's what you've substituted community for. And I totally agree with you. It is a function of wealth and health, and certain things, you know, that allow you to be atomized, because the community was the first social, you know, it was a social safety net. It was, you know, that was the way that you, if, you know, your crops failed, you could still get fed, you know, that was, you know, there, what, you know, community was the first market. I mean, but it was a market informed by evolution and evolutionary psychology and tens of thousands of years of human experience, right? There's a wisdom trapped in the idea of community that, you can't get from like Austrian economics through the Chicago school, like, you know, out into like MMT, right? Like you can't, like you can't force that hand. And I think you're totally right. And to bring it to the supply chain point, so we built our supply chains to be, and it came up from, I believe, the Japanese, right? Where it was called like just-in-time supply chains, right? Like you don't want to hold inventory if you're a producer, you know, you want it to be very efficient. You don't want to like, because like all you want to basically, you prioritize efficiency instead of robustness. And that's what we've done in every category area of our life, right? Are we at risk of being unhealthier in the long term? Almost definitely, right? Because and also even thinking about, you know, what health and longevity, like when people talk about that, like I have a 96-year-old grandmother. She's about to turn 97. And, you know, she went through like a tough period this year, and just seeing what prolonged life looks like, you know, it's like, even like, because I think a lot of people, if you think about when you talked about like, oh, it's just like the science and the numbers, they'll be like, well, look at life expectancy, right? I think, you know, people look at life expectancy and it's amazing, right? And a lot of that actually comes from preventing childhood diseases and death. You know, people don't it's almost like people think that like, you know, people didn't live into their 70s and 80s in ancient Greece. They absolutely did. It just, it was a fewer number because of a variety of things that we placated a lot of those, you know, issues. But now we're starting to get to these points where it's like the affluence and the wealth and the structure that we've created to support that, it's not sustainable like in any dimension. And I think, you know, we need to harken back in many ways to like a lot of the things that got us here. Are you familiar with the concept of the Lindy effect?
I don't think so, no.
Or the Lindy principle. So it's from a gentleman named Nassim Taleb. He's like a famous, he's in the finance space, and he wrote this book, and he's kind of the cornerstone figure in this concept of anti-fragility, and the idea of like, how do you create a world that's anti-fragile? Like we live in a world that is tremendously fragile because it's hyper networked. You know, it is set up for efficiency instead of robustness and resilience. And so like you had shortages of meat at the grocery store. You had, you know, all these things kind of, you know, that we saw that were shown during the beginnings of the pandemic that were just, you know, kind of collapsed. And so that's a very long way of answering your question, but like the Lindy effect is the principle that if something has been being done for a long period of time, it's likely to continue to be so, like to do so, right? So the longevity of a certain phenomenon, object, practice is tied to how long it's already existed. So, you know, Facebook's only existed for, you know, 16 years. Like the chances of it, you know, existing for 160 years versus, you know, the nuclear family is unlikely. And I think we need to really turn around and look at the things that are Lindy, and really start to reincorporate those things into what we would call modern. And I think, yeah, I mean, that's what I would say to that.
No, I think that's a really interesting point. And it's funny because I think it connects really well with the way that I think about like polyamory. So when people talk to me about polyamory, they think of, sexual freedom, being able to have, sex with multiple partners. For me, when I think about polyamory, it's basically, taking away sexuality as a foundational requirement for meaningful relationships. Polyamory, amor, love, right? So polygamy is, gametes, multiple sexual relationships, right? So I think that polyamory is, if we're talking about, long-term, this Lindy effect as it corresponds to the nuclear family or to extended families, coming together, I think polyamory is actually like exactly, is the oldest thing in history. It is the foundation of, meaningful long-term relationships with your community where everyone participates in things like child rearing, and everything else, and stays away from this more, new age phenomenon of, the suburban home and the two parents and their two kids. So, I think that there's a lot pulling us back towards that right now. And I'm just super excited to see what the frameworks are going to be for us to get to that point of, community first, people first, over the next couple decades. But I think that, I think it's probably going to come from, businesses. I think that businesses, in so many ways have there's so much trust in business to be able to indicate what is trustworthy and what is not. And there's a very high likelihood that we will lose that trust at some point, especially with all the changes that are happening. But the only way that I can possibly imagine us really being able to step into, a more polyamory, a more community-focused world is if we have the businesses supporting that and showing people the metrics behind, like, oh, community works, and these are different things we'll sell you to be able to like get back into community, even though that's where we started. And it's such like a silly like loop around, and just requires, more middlemen and more resources. But at the same time, I think I just don't see another path of us being able to get there, because right now there is such a stigmatization against anything that's not standard. And I think that the only things really capable of breaking stigma are, like policy, policy, economics, like policy, business, and, massive social movements. But massive social movements, they even they aren't necessarily as successful all the time, and there's such humongous barriers to them oftentimes, and a lot of people lost in the process typically, fighting for those human rights.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, I by the time you get the original messaging, I mean, you just think about like what happened to Occupy, what happened to BLM. I mean, I really think that there were like a lot. It's like by the time I mean, it's the worst game of telephone you've ever experienced, and it's a shame because it started with the most noble of intentions, right? What I find interesting though also is that people don't. So you talk about business. I think you're totally right to centralize this around businesses, and I think that if I'm a business, I think when people hear you say that, they're like thinking it's like, oh, great, so this is going to come from like the FANG companies or like just really large, well-capitalized tech companies, and I'm not so sure that that's really true. I think because if you think about like the first, okay, we talked about how meaningless, like for example, credit has become, and the concept of debt. Before credit cards and all that, right? Your grocery store was your creditor, right? You could go into the grocer and you got things on credit. And there was an accounting system that they utilized in order to maintain the records, right, of the people going on. This is how we expanded westward into the frontier. I mean, this was before the idea, of credit cards and all these things and the computer systems to be able to uphold that. It was this highly, local phenomenon, and it was centralized around, this almost like utilitarian, business. Which was a business, and it had, it was a private enterprise, it was profit seeking and all these things, but it was able to create this kind of, localized, networked, and, what I think would be called an anti-fragile, if you think about all of it being nestled with all other businesses doing these same things. And I think what's great is so technology, I think in the first iteration of what people have looked at, we've created platform companies, right? But now we're seeing a movement of companies where they're basically giving the platform power of technology to individuals. So the greatest example is like Amazon versus Shopify, right?
Yep.
Shopify has exploded. in terms of, the amount of people monetizing it and using it and leveraging it. I think it's a really great example of using technology to give tools and abilities to small companies that were, only 10 years ago, 5 years ago, in the domain of really large companies. And I think that is the path, and that's the thread, like, to push forward, that could give us, these like techno-Lindy, arrangements and products and relationships, that would really kind of be anti-fragile and something that I think for the most part people would deem, that they would want. I mean, that people would seek out and want in a civilization, in a society.
Definitely. And I also think, there's a lot of pessimism around business as a tool, because I think that the snippet that people have had of business is just so limited, and we're still at the very beginnings of the development of what business actually even looks like. Like we're literally in, like, if we're extending this out 1,000 years, we are very much in like day one of, day zero might have been, a couple hundred years ago, but really we're in day one of like businesses and how businesses function and how they're financed and who owns them and all of these different things. And we're seeing tremendous amounts of alternative business models, which are shown to be more robust, co-op types of models that are evolving to be able to actually run businesses. And at the end of the day, the word business is so dirty, but it's literally a group of individuals, coming together to, accomplish some sort of common action and be able to use that common action to support themselves, to, fulfill their, base needs of survival, right? And like, trying to get people together to actually do something together, I think that, that is the core root of business. And I think most business has been built on, really prioritizing one individual founder or prioritizing the people who start the organization. But I think that that's in the next few decades, we're going to see significantly more models of businesses that are prioritizing the community, probably slowly at first, just allocating 10% of their stuff to, or signing a founder's pledge of 5% of their equity. We're seeing the beginnings of it. But I think that as businesses continue to evolve, we're going to see that they're more robust, that you're actually going to be able to have a significantly larger valuation if you're getting a co-op together and being able to have some sort of community-owned business that's significantly more robust and being able to support itself. So I think business is just changing in general, and it's unfortunate that there's just so much skepticism of it, because I think if as much time was spent, trying to innovate on different types of business models and proving them out, instead of just saying, oh, business, that's a lost cause, politics, that's a lost cause, and just kind of pushing these things to the wayside instead of thinking about what are innovative ways we can transform them. I just think we would be innovating in a way that could be helping a lot more people in a much better way than we've been able to over the last few centuries.
Okay, I mean, so that's the private sector. And you obviously also spend time in the decentralized governance space. So like, when you consider decentralized governance, like you could have, right, consortiums of companies that kind of, pool together to kind of create a governance structure or standards, right? Like, could you imagine like a main street of X town and a main street of Y town, and they have different kind of standards that they've procured for their main street, right? Or something. You can imagine a potential like something like that. But where does the public sector, do you think, play into all of this? Obviously, like, because in many ways, certain laws need to change because they preclude some of these arrangements, they preclude some of these activities. But where do you see the public sphere helping, at bare minimum, not hindering it? But where could it potentially be where they're actually kind of playing a proactive role in achieving this as an outcome in a possible future?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because it's tough to like know how to get a government to support the freedom of its own citizens to leave, right? But I think that I think that there needs to be just more infrastructure to compete for citizens. I think that if there's anything for us to be prioritizing, I think it's like freedom of migration and the freedom to be able to choose the jurisdictions that you're a part of or you contribute to, putting tools in the hands of people to, if they're dissatisfied with the governance system that they're a part of, that even within, the specific lands that they're in, they can, start their own jurisdiction. And I don't know, it's tough because there are so many pieces that come into play when it's like self-governance. Like, can you set up your own municipality as just like your own home? And even if you can do that, there's still so many people who aren't property owners, and then they become disenfranchised. They're not able to access this new system of governance. So then the government isn't competing fully because it knows that it has a lockdown on the most impoverished in society. So there's a lot of like really big questions to ask there of like, how do you set up a system? But I think that there's a few things to look for. I think that at the end of the day, we should be structuring society in a way where individuals should have some sort of just greater autonomy to be able to leave and set up their own systems of governance with their friends, with their close communities, and be provided the resources to do that by some sort of central entity. And maybe that is, the next step, right? It's not just you're competing, you're actually supporting people to go and break off and almost collect data on what it looks like to build your own governance system, experiment with alternative models. All the businesses are now co-ops. This form of governance is completely different than what we've seen. And there are projects that are trying to do this, like the Seasteading Institute. I don't know if you've heard of that project before. Yeah, so really, really interesting. And I think that like that's the very beginning, is being able to experiment, much like you do with a startup, in regards to the different systems of governance, political systems, economic systems, to like really see what is possible, communicating that to, not to a centralized party, but making that open source information so that people can know and we can understand and analyze when groups of people come together in these combinations with these rules, with this amount of resources. We see, those longer longevity or more longevity, or we see just better life, like more joy in society, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I don't know, like I think that those are some of the things, but it's that I think is going to be like the most difficult question to answer over the next 100 years, is like, how do we build societies where anyone who is questioning their society is able to freely break off, be provided with the resources to try and build their own thing, and at the end of the day, create more information and knowledge and wisdom for people, and rejoin society if they find that what they've built is not necessarily, to the betterment for whatever reasons. But I don't know, there's, all of this is theoretical. Like, we don't know like what's actually going to work. We don't know like the long-term effects of something like that or these types of systems. So there's a lot to ask there.
No, but I do think we do have a North Star in the form of federalism. So, one of the things that I think is like why I throughout the tumultuous the year, I'm still so optimistic for the United States of America in particular, is because of the concept of federalism. So like, if you look right at what's happened in San Francisco, I think 90,000 households left San Francisco this year. There are 330,000 households. If that was New York City, that'd be like 2.8 million people leaving New York City, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've kind of seen, there's been a huge migration, particularly to Miami. The mayor of Miami has been basically probably using Twitter in the most effective way that we've seen since Trump's 2016 election, in terms of like being able to actually generate like political movements and he's sequestering an enormous, like a non-trivial percentage of companies, VCs and so on from the San Francisco space. So you are seeing, and this has a lot to do with the fact that the governance structure in San Francisco started to really villainize the people that were forming a very large percentage of their tax base, and those people left. And whether you disagree with that or not, what I'm saying is it's a template. Federalism is already I think a template of that thing. However, there's something wrong with federalism right now. Federalism and just all forms of kind of like formal governance in the United States has really been once again co-opted and optimized for efficiency, not for like the community. You just don't. So like it's not like that's not a solution. I'm saying it's just a template. And I guess if you're wondering, because so the state uses like a few tools that it is like the cornerstone of. So like taxation, it has a monopoly on violence and the adjudication of law. Some of those things, right? I don't see, I mean, we'll see. You know, we'll see with people who've looked at things like community policing and defunding the police, and we'll see like some of those things will work, some of those things will end terribly, and then like as you said, like you can get data, take that data, and then like like find it anew. I guess I wonder like if one of the strengths of America is to actually just run 1,000 of these experiments in different areas. But I wonder is like what I don't see is somebody who's aggregating all of that data and then trying to like actually instill something as a result of like analyzing that data. I feel like that would be helpful for people.
Yeah, I think the first step is just setting up the system for individual citizens to be able to generate that and making that open source and making sure that that can be shared with everyone, and not having that centralized. And then I think based on the results of that type of information, we can begin to make policy changes. But I think and I don't again like it's difficult to know how far that'll go, what will happen. But like, I think that the first step is just giving people the tools to be able to run these little experiments in an informal way to give us a little bit more, like just some more numbers to be able to work off of and like just see what types of experiments do people come up with, what types of societies, like how do these things run. I think that the really big issue, and as you were talking, I was thinking about it, that we're going to face regardless of, even if we get all of this data out, even if we get policy changes made to allow for people to create their own systems of governance, et cetera, I think we're going to be dealing with a few really, really complex issues. One of them being just human discomfort, right? Like, because I think that so much of the change that we talk about is based on, okay, we feel uncomfortable around something. There's something that feels off and we want to like change it as a result of that so that we don't feel that discomfort anymore. The problem is like discomfort is also such a great tool for like growth and sticking in discomfort and staying in discomfort for our own self-growth. So it's really difficult to know like especially with community building, right? Like how many of us that feel like we have really good relationships with our families today have very vivid memories of like horrible fights and things that broke out with our families as well, and the discomforts faced there, right? Like if we had just like been able to like go and get up and leave, right? Like there wouldn't have been any sort of personal growth or self-growth. There are definitely families that are it's dangerous for people to be in, and there it makes a lot of sense to like allow for kids to emancipate and be on their own. But there is so much discomfort. Like I definitely, like there was a day that I ran away from home when I was like a lot younger. My parents got like into beef, right? And like I came back at the end of the day, but let's say that this stuff is much more built out, and people have significantly more freedom. At the end of the day, are we allowing for individuals to, really be actually chasing something where they can find more joy by providing like more freedoms in this specific dimension? And it's so difficult to know. Like one more point on this as well is like I've been thinking a lot about just like danger, for instance, right? Like it's funny because so many of my friends who grew up in tougher neighborhoods, I kind of like lived in both. My early childhood was spent in a tougher neighborhood, but then I moved into the suburbs, and I got to like experience and live, and still in my life today, my friend group is like very diverse in regards to the like socioeconomic classes that they come from. And something that I've noticed is that my friends who've grown up in tougher neighborhoods, they feel danger in a very different way than my more affluent friends do. There's a lot more realism to danger. There's a lot less paranoia about certain things, because when you grow up in an environment where there's actual danger, you're constantly gathering these data points of like, okay, this is a place I should be, this is where I shouldn't be, this is something I can be doing, something I can't. And you're constantly gathering this like in your mental model of what that is. When you're in an affluent community and there's no real danger present, you're basically forming your model of danger off of like tales and what people are telling you and things like that. And then you end up, in my perspective, I feel like developing a lot more paranoia because like everything's just based off of a story, but you don't actually develop a real gut for like where real danger is and it isn't. And so it's so complex because it's like there are certain things that are super, seem really bad for us, like being in dangerous environments, that also build up our guts to be able to feel more secure when we actually exit that environment, or within that environment to be able to protect ourselves. So it's like the more harm we're exposed to in in like with some, there's definitely barriers and boundaries, but small doses of danger and feeling that, small doses of all of these different types of things, of toxic relationships, for instance, it's hard to pick up on toxic relationships until you've dated a shit ton of people, but you have to go through those relationships to be able to see that. And so I think that that's building, so many of these conversations relate to building, almost utopias or building society in a better way. But it's just so hard to figure out how to do that, I think, because so much of what makes us better, people in regards to our health, is being exposed to inoptimal conditions that train us how we can deal with those difficulties in more robust ways.
I could not agree more. And I think just to summarize kind of what you said there, one, I think you don't want to make it too easy to exit an uncomfortable situation, because you may prevent yourself from learning a lesson or gaining that, that those data points and so on. Obviously there's like some like you have to think about some like threshold or something where it then becomes punitive as opposed to informative. But I also love, right, the idea of, I completely agree that like you do not want, like you would never want to rate, if you really like thought about for your children and all these things, like you wouldn't want to arbitrarily subject them to danger, but you also wouldn't want to put them in a bubble, right? And because their inability then to kind of navigate the world outside of your bubble becomes like obviously, right, very, very difficult. And I think I saw this where I see this represented at scale. And once again, just calling on personal experience. In Israel, everyone is a veteran for the most part. They've all served in the military. Mm-hmm. And that country's been at war for like in perpetuity. So like these people aren't like in Germany, getting drunk in Berlin like an American soldier maybe. Like they're actually like, right, like engaged in combat, unfortunately. And that's not a political, there's no political like angle to that. It just is a fact. And when you're with these people, there's at no point where I felt danger, or like whether it was on a hike or I don't know, just like in a tenuous, area of like the West Bank or something like that. They're not I can look whenever I felt threatened or whatever, like I can't like. They were calm because they know that you're touching on this. It's like they know the difference of like something being a little like off or something like that, or being in a novel scenario versus like actually being in danger. Like they know exactly what it looks like. And I was in scenarios where things like where I could tell like, oh, okay, like we really need like to do things. And like, and I just find that like when I moved back to New York, I remember sitting in Williamsburg, like at a coffee shop. And I was overhearing the conversation that was like behind me and just realizing how affluent and detached from like any sense of need or want, like, or fear, right? Like America is so affluent at this point, right? That there is a population of people, particularly in the upper middle class, that like, I forget, there was some existential French philosopher who ironically said like he never actually experienced like a day of dread a day in his life, right? Mm-hmm. And I also recently heard somebody tweet out, right, like food, the purpose of a food surplus is like existential angst, right? And it's just this kind of, so I completely agree with you that because you can get into a very non-productive, untethered, view. I think. And I see that riddling, for example, the upper middle class of the United States, which where I came out of, and where like my social circles like predominantly like are. And I couldn't agree with you more that like those people usually they tend to when they are faced with discomfort, they're not able to cope with that. It's like they really don't have any experience to call upon. They tend to fold, right? You look at like, and you think about like mental, you think about drugs and SSRIs and all these things, like they're outsourcing like their ability to actually handle those scenarios to that drug, to that compound. I think you can make an argument, and it's just, yeah. So I think you're absolutely like on the money. So I'll ask you though, so I think I completely agree with you. What I'm just trying to think what that could look like, right? Like, how do you inject that learning and those scenarios? How do you create, whether it's like, I don't know, is it VR or like, what is it that you could do to is it just creating more spaces for inter-socioeconomic conversations and storytelling? Like, what is it that could provide people that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you can be as like futuristic as like virtual reality simulations that like plug into you, or you can be as, today as, all kids have to spend several years living abroad in, different economic regions and zones, like I, one provides manufactured danger, the other one provides, more real instability. Um, but I don't know, like I forgot what the book was. It was a long time ago, but um, there was basically a conversation that was taking place about can you ever pretend to be can you ever choose to be homeless, and truly choose to be, because when you choose to be homeless, that means that you still have the choice to go back. And so your brain and how it interprets that experience is very different than someone who is living with the consistent anxiety of the fact that there is no way out and that you are trapped in this. And like that might be the biggest difference. And like that makes all the difference. Like you can, and until you really are left without a choice, you're not homeless, you're just camping, like, and so it's really difficult because you can't, I think it's really tough to like manufacture this stuff as well.
Mhm.
Like you really have to provide some sort of realism to it. And that means, putting people into compromised positions. And I don't know, like do, do I feel like the world would be better if we like traveled more and saw more different types of, lifestyles and, um, ways of being? Like, yeah, I definitely do. I think that that's super important. And I think it's one of the reasons why there's, such a large conservative base in this country, is there's so many people who have never traveled outside of their towns, and
And
they're very,
Merrick, on that exact point, because one of
yeah.
the more interesting things I've seen somebody talk about that could potentially address this is, and this is on both ends. So you're talking about the conservative, base who maybe view, whether it's racial categories or if it's just lifestyles or it's just their inability. But you could make the exact same point to a cosmopolitan New Yorker who does not understand what it's like to live in Appalachia and be like just as dispossessed as like, as kind of like the worst off people in the United States. And they suggested basically creating something akin to like a birthright, right? Where like, if you grew up in a cosmopolitan, whatever, area, like you will go, and we'll pick it up on the taxpayer's dime to, or whether it's like a civil service, I don't know, kind of component where you could, you get to go and like you live in Appalachia. And by the way,
Mhm.
the reverse, right? So that child in Appalachia gets to see, what it's like to be a cosmopolitan New Yorker, and see what security feels like. Because for the affluent person, it's important to be able to have experience insecurity in a certain sense, right? Or like danger, as we're talking about. But it's also super critical for people who are dispossessed or marginal and so on to feel to have an understanding or an experience of what security could look like,
Mhm.
to know that it's achievable and to know what it feels like, because I think that's highly motivating. And so
Yeah.
that's one suggestion I've heard posited, of like basically like a the coasts to the hinterland, kind of transfer and movement of young people.
Yeah. So a couple points on that. So I think that, the liberal cosmopolitan and, the, deep South conservative, I think that they might struggle with that same type of lack of exposure to other ways of being. But I think it's for very different reasons. I think that, in regards to the deep South, I think it's actually a much easier problem to solve because you have a lot of the economic struggle of life, but you don't necessarily have just exposure to people other than yourself that have different faiths, of different races, et cetera. And so I think that I think that there's something to be said about like birthright living, abroad for a little while, things like that. I think it's a much harder problem to solve for, more affluent, upper middle class liberals, because again, you can go and live in those places, but your mindset, it's kind of that homeless example, right? Like your mindset doesn't necessarily, you don't feel what that insecurity actually is, and you're always able to buy a plane ticket back home as soon as you start to feel off, so
Mm.
there's an immediate line of escape, and it's just, it's always going to be an experience, but it's never going to be like living that life. And there's also been research, I think, that's been done in regards to exchange programs. I remember that there was I think it was like an episode of NPR that talked about, or some sort of podcast that talked about, basically this group of kids from like an economically disadvantaged part of the Bronx who were going to like a more private upper class school to just like tour it and things like that. And it what's interesting is like it describes like what their experience was like. It describes how multiple children there like freaked out during just even the field trip, because they felt so insecure by being at this private institution, and also just like hopeless in many ways that this is not something that they're ever going to be able to access. And so I think that there's a lot of different complexities, especially when you bring in like the immense segregation of race in this country and where people feel secure. But I do think that, like, for instance, the way that we structure schools, I think that that's like a really important piece, is like the fact that we're still doing it by like, this is your jurisdiction, this is where you pay taxes, and this is where you go to public school, and like how much segregation that causes, and the history of redlining and all of these different types of things. I think that that's a small piece that we really need to be working on, is just basically, yeah. I think that there's a book, I think it's called like the imperative of desegregation or something like that. But basically, yeah, just talking about some of these different types of concepts. And I think that just starting even at a young age with individuals from different types of socioeconomic backgrounds coming together, and allowing for the families to also be involved in communicating with one another. Like I went to a pretty diverse public school. It wasn't the most diverse, but for our city, it was quite diverse. And there was not just a lot of people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, there was also a lot of people from different countries all around the world. And that was priceless in a lot of ways for community building, for building trust across boundaries, for being able to just like work through a lot of just like difficult shit that happens. And certain people, come out of that experience and had an incredible time and learned about a lot from just being around people who are different than themselves. Certain people come out, being really frustrated at that experience. So I don't think that there's ever going to be a solution that's going to be holistic, but I do think that like more practices of desegregation, even in our local communities, I think is really important, but it needs to be done in a really strategic and sensitive way. Because like, again, bringing, our public school, it was a public school, it was the closest public school to the city, but like it was also like a top 50 public school in the country, and in the city of Rochester we have like immense economic disparity. And it's one of the inner city school district is one of the worst school districts in the entire state, including New York City. I think it's like bottom 5 or something like that. So extremely important. So we had like an urban suburban program where we bring students from the inner city and put them into our school. And like that exchange never goes backwards, of course, but like to the yeah, in protest of all the suburban white suburban moms who are there, right? But it was also very shocking, I think, for a lot of the students who came to the school, and many of them weren't able to necessarily last for very long, just because like even at that point, even when you're coming over in 6th grade and 7th grade, just the difference in education, is just so ridiculously different. And you see it even more in college, like individuals who come from like really bad public schools and like show up at like at a college with a bunch of kids who like went to private schools and things like that. It's just like, you have students who literally don't have like the basics of algebra, studying with folks who took like, Calc 3,
Yeah.
and it's just like, there's such disparity there. But even at like a middle school level, you still get those disparities. So there's just, these are such big problems to like, tango with and figure out
Yeah.
how to resolve.
unfortunately, what I feel like we've done is like a lot of the policies that are passed are policies that either like sound good to us or feel good, right? Like it feels good to say like we're going to set up this urban suburban program, right? Um, but if it's not, as you're mentioning, like if it's not thought out in a like a holistic human, human oriented fashion, then like that could cause just as much problems as it could cause enormous issues for the kids that it's trying to help and so on. But I want to make a little bit of a segue because what I'm seeing, right, with kind of all the things we've talked about thus far, right, is like a lot of it has to do with like individuals, their relationships to potentially their governments, the businesses that they, either work for or consume services or products at, and so on. How they have their relationships, both sexual and platonic. And it's about, and we've talked about danger and how you kind of inject, and it's a lot of it is focused right around like kind of your mental model of the world, how you kind of see the world and interact with it. And I wonder if like this parable of your life and your interests, to be currently in the psychedelic space. Like I want to talk about that because there's no shortage of research, right, of increased amounts of empathy, certain, complex thinking, or the ability, after going through, psychedelic experiences, of coming out of those experiences very different than they entered. With often very very positive effects. Not that those psychedelic experiences were always so pleasurable either, right? I mean, if we talk about manufactured terror or or just things that were that you've suppressed that memory of that fight or you running away or something like that, and you go through a psychedelic experience which resurfaces that, presents that to you, again, you relive it in a certain sense. Am I right? Am I picking up on like a real thread that like, did you arrive at psychedelics, Marik, because it's not a silver bullet? I would never, obviously these things are very complex, but it does address kind of a lot of this stuff very head on. What was it about it, psychedelics, that had you kind of get there? And do you see it as having that potential, multiplier effect in a lot of these other things that we've talked about?
Yeah, I definitely do. And I don't think that that's, I arrived to psychedelics more because I just saw the power of psychedelics to be able to build community when used properly. And like, again, I think everything that I do in life is about how do we get better at building stronger communities. And so that's really why I'm here, I would say. But I think that the substances like speak for themselves in regards to their power, both in the positive and negative. I think a lot of people are, I think with proper guidance is like the most important part, with like proper preparation and integration and like making sure that it's accompanied by therapy and things like that. Because
Right.
you can step into also extremely deep traumas with the use of psychedelics when they're used in inappropriate settings, especially in like much more chaotic settings like clubs and festivals and things like that, where people are not as sensitive to, the vulnerability that you're stepping into. So
Right.
I don't know, like I think that we're going to see, a lot of great things come from psychedelics. There are a lot of psychedelics. I think we're going to see a lot of really scary things as well. And I think we saw those things in the 60s and 70s. I think we're going to get like repeats of those things. Anyone who's saying that like, no one's going to jump out of windows, like, of course, like we saw this happen before many times over. When people are not in, proper sets and settings, these things do happen. Like, are we going to see another wave of narcissists and psychopaths using these compounds to exploit people? 100%. Are we going to see, like significant rates of sexual assault in, psychedelic clinics and retreat centers and things like that? Yes, that's already been happening for the last few decades abroad and at home as we continue to build this ecosystem. So this is like the, I think that this is probably going to be the most interesting shift in humanity, is the rollout of psychedelics. And that's another thing that like keeps me here, is like the conversations you're having on a daily basis are this, like you are really trying to figure out what does it mean to roll out a substance that allows for people to interact with their version of God, to change their consciousness, to like experience things, experience their subconscious directly in front of them in a visual way, relive trauma and change their perspective on it. Like these are humongous shifts in consciousness. And but how do you roll that out? How do you bundle up something so expansive that has so many different externalities, both positive and negative, and how do you package that in pretty much a pill and provide that to individuals in a way that's going to allow for them to actually get the best possible results from something like this. And that is a very, very difficult question to answer, and something that we're battling against all the time is like, how do we allow for this to integrate with policy and with high growth capitalism in a way that doesn't, again, put the people to the wayside and prioritize profits to the demise of individuals, but also just like all of the different interpersonal things that have to be done at the same time. Because like, I think so much is about brand, and working in psychedelics, you are standing by a very particular brand, and like you have to uphold that brand for people to continue to believe that you're authentic in what you're doing. And the brand of psychedelics is like, you are connecting to community, you are doing the self-work, you are prioritizing people over money, and that is a difficult brand to uphold while building businesses, like that's just really fucking tough. And like, there's very high standards to meet to really allow for something to last for the long term in this space and be respected by the end consumers who will eventually be, actually interacting with these compounds and substances. I think that the people who are going really fast today and like trying to grow something as fast as possible and getting it into the clinics, I think they're going to lose a lot of support. That's just my personal opinion. I think they're going to lose a lot of support from the end consumers. And I think that there's going to be a lot of waves of individuals who just are turned off by integrating these compounds into the same medicalized system as we've had that has been done a very poor job of serving so many people. Whether that'll be enough of a disappointment in turn away to make those companies unsuccessful, probably not. I think that those companies will still be largely successful. They're going to get their products into the hands of people, just like cannabis has. But I do think that there's a core community of people who will turn away, more conscious consumers. And I think that that demographic continues to grow. And I think the types of businesses that cater to that demographic continue to grow. And so I don't know, if we're talking 15 years down the line, which is when the experts are predicting we're going to see federal legalization of psychedelics, broadly, 15 years, a lot can change in 15 years. And so we'll really see where this ends up and the relationship of the end consumer to the businesses who are creating this today.
So two questions. So one, you talked about like trying to figure out, like this is a conversation that's like omnipresent in the psychedelics community. Once again, maybe like reintroducing that concept of like the Lindy effect, right? Human societies have had a relationship with psychedelics for a very long time. We have some of those societies still alive and with us today, in South America and in Africa. And I believe also the Aborigines have some relationship, if I'm not wrong. Have people been thinking about how do you kind of, learn from the way that they've created relationships with their compounds and figured out how do you kind of translate that into a market-oriented, advanced, form of like, capitalism and civilization, right? It's like, wow, like what's so interesting about this, Marik, and why, I've always, why I came to you, like even originally, was just the concept of an advanced technological society having a relationship with these compounds is like astonishing to think about, right? And what that looks like is obviously so interesting and important. So one, I mean, have people looked at kind of these relationships that these communities and figured out, and like, how do you scale up some of those relationships? What doesn't, like what can't be scaled up? And then the second question is there any part of the brand of psychedelics, which I guess really comes from people like, right, like Leary and Ram Dass, and right, if I'd imagine, who kind of said that you think needs to change, and like would be like the community would benefit from changing certain things, and what if so, like what are some of those things that you think need to change?
Yeah. So to answer the second one first, I think like the change that I would like to see as of today is I would love to see media being a bit more cautious in how it talks about these compounds, how it advertises them, preparing people for the negative events and statistics that are ultimately going to come in the next 5 years. Like we should be talking about that stuff today, and we should be saying like, hey, listen, like here's a cause benefit analysis. This is how many people are going to have schizophrenic breaks just statistically from these compounds rolling out. This is how many people are going to die because they're doing, a particular compound like ibogaine, where it is, much more possible than for psilocybin, for instance, or, they jump from a window and they're in an irresponsible setting. These are the statistics. This is what's going to happen. And these are the benefits and how many people it's going to benefit. But both of these things exist. I think taking a much more neutral tone, I think would be good. And I think also taking a neutral tone in regards to the community behind this, it's very difficult for me. One big question I've been asking myself like this entire year and for years prior as well is like, what is the place of aggression in our society? And it's still difficult for me to answer. I don't have an answer, but I just tend to feel that like creating more aggression, introducing more aggression into any space creates more polarization, and that polarization prohibits from different perspectives coming together to optimize, solutions and come up with better ideas together. And I think that that's something that, was very much in the 60s, this like the counterculture and the culture of like, separate of like, oh, like capitalism sucks, blah, blah, blah. There was even, I'm reading right now about Charles Manson and his relationship with psychedelics and the family and things like that. And what's so interesting is like, there were, after the murders, there were literally newspapers, like liberal newspapers that were saying like, yeah, like, why not kill the rich? Like,
Yeah.
right. So it's like, it's funny because like there were media outlets that were just like, okay, like whatever, he killed some rich people, fine. Like, that's great. That's better for society. And we're going to get to that point again. Like already this conversation of like eat the rich is beginning. And it's like, yes, like there's definitely immense disparity in society. There's immense oppression and social injustice as a result of that. But is introducing more aggression, more polarization, really the way that we're going to allow for resources to be redistributed and for people to come together? I don't know. Like it's tough. And at the end of the day, like so many people are like looking for revolution. And I don't think people understand what that means. And people just like want to fight, but don't understand what that actually means to like really fight and to be in war and to be in revolution. And the amount of loss that happens, and not the loss that happens on the rich people's side, the loss that happens on the impoverished and the oppressed community side on behalf of oftentimes the wealthy trying to just fight for their political opinions. So like, at the end of the day, I don't know, like, I just think that those are certain things that need to change. We need to be like more gentle with people. And, if you don't want to work with someone, you don't have to work with them. But like, communicating what you think, trying to earn your seat at every table, figuring out how you can move the conversation forward and like nudge people everywhere you go, nudge them in the direction of building things that are more community-based, that are more people-focused. And you can do that in small ways, asking, small asks, like, this is how we're going to like, build this and set an example, because again, this is decades in the making. We should be doing those nudges today. And if those nudges don't happen, then that's not going to grow over time. We're just going to polarize, and then the companies will be the companies and the community will be the community, and those will continue to remain separate. So just some thoughts there. But could you repeat the first question? I don't remember.
It was like reintroducing the concept of Lindy and saying like, so that we have like these old human civil societies that have had relationships with psychedelics, and is that illustrative or helpful in figuring out what it could look like for an advanced civilization to have relationships?
Yeah, so there's researchers studying this right now, like seeing like what does like ayahuasca in an indigenous context, like how does that compare to like a clinical context and things like that. So people are definitely researching that and super interested, and there's entire groups of people who are developing training programs based around indigenous methodologies of these medicines. What I think that any indigenous community would admit to in that process is that like there is no indigenous community that exists today that really hasn't been touched by, Western civilization, or, however you want to call it. So everyone's influenced. And so many of those individuals, like, they're looking for economic prosperity through the medicines. They want to be able to sell this stuff to tourists so that they can like have more money to then be able to like go and support their communities. So it's already influenced through kind of these more capitalist, ideologies. There's also just like, a lot, the the like legacies and traditions of like who can become shamans and who can actually, do this work is being passed down to individuals who didn't necessarily grow up in those communities. And even within those communities, like, there's still certain issues. So I don't know, it's super, and at the same time, the youth of all of these indigenous communities is consuming like Western media all the time and like seeing like rappers and like, just like rock stars, like, living lavish lifestyles that typically are, focused on, ideals that maybe aren't necessarily the best for introduction into a spiritual journey.
Right.
Whether that's to do with sexism or to do with high growth capitalism. So I don't know. It's just like there's a lot of complexity there because there's certain things you can learn from indigenous communities, which I think are really important to pay attention to, including kind of preparation. That's still something that's really important. Integration. That's still something that's important. Having like a shaman who is conducting the ceremony in certain ways. Like there's a lot of different theories on that. But holding the container, I think, is important. So I don't know. There's a lot of different things that we can learn, but I think that there's a lot of things that we're still asking. Is that necessarily the right method? And if it's not, then what is?
Right.
We've all lost our own. Many of us have lost our own legacies. Even people who are very still culturally informed about their legacy and culture are still disconnected from what it was, even 100 years ago.
Absolutely.
And so it's like, it's difficult to know, like we've lost a lot of that knowledge already. And so it's tough to know, like, what do we go back to and whether what was there at the beginning was also like magnitudes more effective than like what we're trying to build today in certain ecosystems. And the variety of things that people are trying to build today is also so varied. So we're just going to have to see.
Yeah. Do you think, like, as things, and I know we're kind of coming up, and let me know if like you have a hard stop, but okay, I'll tell you my big thesis like about a lot of things is like a lot of like the first part of our conversation, like solving like governance issues, there's geopolitical things also that we didn't really talk to, the relationship of like us to our monetary system, a lot of like it's very I'm very much of the belief that like a lot of these things are going to get shaked out like in the 2020s, like the 2020s. Like I'm not going to prevent anyone from celebrating the end of 2020. It was a hard year, but like I'm not exactly so certain that like we should expect 2021, 2022, 2023 to be like all that like easier to go through, just because we're in this period of like tremendous transformation and a shift. But on the other side of that is something I've been thinking about a lot. It's also something that's also allows you to kind of, you feel like you have a goal to work up to. And I believe I talked to you about this, but this concept of an axial age, which was something that was originally it was coined by a German sociologist, which is talking about the first axial age being basically the 500 years where you saw like the Buddha, Jesus, Aristotle, all these people who kind of shifted humanity into like another layer of abstraction. And we've kind of, some people say that there was a second axial age at the Enlightenment and that like, that shifted us again. But I very much see that that's potentially highly likely out of necessity for humanity, right? Like we cannot continue on let's call it the consciousness stack that we have today. It's very obvious that is not sustainable, right? That the way that we view the world is not conducive to a long-term survival of the race, of the planet, of so on. And I just really can't help but think that psychedelics has like an incredibly important role to play in that. One, what do you is that how you also kind of think about like when it all shakes out, in the end, or like one thing, whether it's 15 years or whatever, when you have an advanced society that has a much healthier relationship to these compounds, what does that like look like and what happens as a result of that?
Yeah. So I think like psychedelics will amplify this shakedown, and I think that the shakedown will be just more intense as a result of psychedelics. I think on the other side, it's really difficult because we still don't really, we keep talking about like a healthier relationship with these substances, but we have so little data to know what a healthier relationship actually is right now. Like for instance, going back to the indigenous point, like some indigenous community members like talk about like ayahuasca as like the television of the jungle, like you just like take it and like that's how you entertain yourself. So we don't know, like maybe a healthier version of like what we have today is like, yeah, you're with close friends who like are experienced, and like you're just at, at some place and you're able to take this during a weekend, etc. Some version, like we have one person in our incubator right now that's like working on basically like this is super interesting, and like we could dive into this, but they're working on a form of psychedelic therapy that's based on narrative therapy using the different archetypes of like tarot cards, for instance, and like looking at tarot cards as the components of any possible story, and then allowing for individuals to play the role of any possible story within a live setting with psychedelics, and using that as almost a form of harm reduction, because instead of playing out your own desires and tensions with other people, you have to play the role that you've been assigned. And so if you have sexual tension within you, you're not here representing your sexual tension. You're representing this specific archetype to be able to interact with others in a healthier way, and you're being given specific guidelines under which to play out a role. So like there's like very like interesting new forms of like what psychedelic therapy could look like. Right now, literally the only type of psychedelic therapy that we even have research on is like you put on a blindfold, you put on a playlist, and you lay there for 8 hours. Like that's it. Like we have no clue really on, even like the indigenous practices, the research is still at the very beginning stages. So we just need a lot more time to be able to see like what the, after the shakedown, what that more positive relationship looks like. I think it's really going to magnify the shakedown. I don't think we're going to get to a point in 10 years of time, 15, 20 years of time where like we're sitting there and it's like, yeah, like we have a great relationship with this. I think we're still going to be seeing centralized powers trying to use this like technology to exploit people, individuals trying to use this tech to exploit people. Like the CIA is already again sponsoring research on using psychedelics to be able to use it with their deployed forces, and like to basically be able to like bring in individuals who've been in war, heal them from the trauma that they've suffered, and then not, they don't say specifically send them back, but like that's
Right,
the
yeah.
intention, right? It's like you don't have to suffer the cost. You give someone this like very inexpensive compound, you can heal them, and then you can send them back into war, and you don't have to worry about the costs associated with then like putting them on disability or treating them, et cetera, right? It's like tremendous cost savings to just have the same person redeployed over and over again and like healing them. And like, so I don't know, there's a lot of like really dark ways that we can be using these compounds as well. And, just as successful or unsuccessful, you could say, as like, the United States and Canada and European powers are at really trying to promote individualism and individual liberties and all of these things, and using these compounds for good and self-growth, there's just as much power on the opposite side, believing that authoritarianism is the way to resolve all of human issues, and not just the governments and the centralized powers themselves. Like you meet anyone from China, that almost every single person I meet from China is in full support of like many of the things that their government is doing. And listen, I don't have the answer. I don't know. Maybe like it is in some ways better. They were able to like suppress COVID faster and like, eliminate it in many ways. And like they can organize and, things like that much faster because they have these very authoritarian powers. I do think that it's really dangerous because you're putting these large existential questions of like what is good and what is bad into the hands of like literally just a handful of people, and then designing systems to do that. And like, so it's inherently supremely limiting. But I don't know, like, again, so many of these questions are unanswered of like how much governance is, makes us happier. Like we know that like too many options at a grocery store also like make us less happy and more anxious about like everything that's there. So I don't know, like we finally have the power, technology, and the centralized authorities, or on the opposite side, the communal dynamics, to build infrastructure that determines for us the existential questions and how we live them, not just asking them, but actually now we are being forced to live them, whether that's like being left in the wild, wild west and choosing anything we want to do, or being under strict governance control. And like, we just don't have the answers to so many of these things. So it's hard for me to say like what this is all going to turn out to be, because we don't even know like what is the right North Star. And I don't know. And I feel like oftentimes we're so confident about like, this should be better, but then you like start asking deeper questions and reading more. And then you're like, I really don't know, I really don't know. Or at least that's how I feel a lot of the time, is like, I'm not really sure. What I do think is like, we need to keep experimenting and understanding and creating feedback loops for ourselves. And I think that that's going to allow for us to at least see what North Stars exist for us to follow. And that loop can only be created if we have the full range of possibilities to experiment with, to really be able to understand like what is and is not better for society as a whole. And like, that's really where I'm trying to push things with these kind of counterculture controversial pillars, is like a broader range of tools for us to experiment and build feedback loops for ourselves to improve over time as a society.
Well, I think that's like a great place to like to end it. But I'll ask you. I mean, really, I feel like I want to like summarize what I've like felt like from the conversation is like, it seems to me, right? I've in a lot of these conversations, a lot of like the stuff that I've been like looking at, it really seems to me that there's like a huge movement, like this concept of Lindy. If you're familiar with like trad Twitter, which is like this, like, go back to, let's harken back to tradition, and like let's lean on the things that we know worked for a long period of time. And while I have some sympathies to that, and like I the Lindy, like the principle of Lindy, I think is like a very, very useful and actually generative, interestingly, like thing in our day and age. But that like we're just not in that world anymore, and so we do need to marry that with like what we've learned thus far now in this like kind of new era. And what I find is like a lot of what you've discussed seems to be like the beginnings of like that synthesis. Sex work, as people always, say, is like one of the oldest forms of work in the world. Right? How do we, overlay that and like legitimize that, protect that in the 2020s, right? How do we, communities have existed for a very long time, but we have nation states. We're a networked global civilization. How do you create communities that like interplay and play like on, both that at a national level and an international level? And then of course, you're talking about consciousness and the use, and you're talking about harm reduction and kind of trauma and all these different things that we've kind of talked about. And I just think it's a fantastic synthesis that I find going on between all of those things. I'll ask you one final question that I've now begun to ask everyone. Yeah. I started the podcast because I felt that young people in particular had developed an enormous sense of learned helplessness. Just because a lot of the conversations are very fatalistic in nature. They're very, they really seem out of grasp in terms of a solution. And I've chosen the people on the podcast that I've talked to because I believe that they're an example of people that are grabbing the reins. What would you recommend for people having done it? At least I prescribe that you've done it. How would you prescribe or suggest that other people, grab the reins in any category of their life, whether it's like interpersonal or professional or so on? What was it that helped you get there and drive you there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I'm also trying to be like significantly better at not giving answers to these types of things, but instead giving questions that I would ask myself to be able to come to the conclusion.
Perfect.
And I think, yeah, like, and so I need to think about it a little, but I think some questions I would ask is like, where am I currently in my relationship to the people around me? Do I have a strong community, a strong family? If not, that tends to be, I think, for me, one of the main cornerstones. And so it might be something just asking yourself, and also asking yourself, like, how important is community and people in your life? And if that's not something that's being prioritized, prioritizing that. I think, secondly, like knowing that there's going to be parts of your life that you are growing through and you are really battling against, and asking yourself, like, what are those main things? Like, what are the things that you're really, really struggling with, and seeking the help to be able to go and resolve those things. Like for me, like I definitely have a lot of like personal mental health, types of conversations that I'm constantly embroiled in that, on a day-to-day basis provide me with a lot of struggle. But there's a lot of other pieces in my life that are also like super fulfilling and super good that I can dive into and give myself a break from those really difficult questions, and then dive back into working with the people I need to like be able to process those personal things. So like that would be another question, is like, what are your core problems and who are the people, again, who can really help you resolve those things, or at least work towards a solution and make you feel that you're like well held in that journey. And then the third thing I think is like just, not having expectations, like really, like I guess that's an answer. What are your expectations? For me, I try to stay away from that, but I think for people, like just understanding what are your expectations and knowing that like the reason why you might be disappointed by something is not because like there's this inherency to that moment, but because you had an expectation of it that maybe shouldn't have been there. And so like analyzing what are your expectations of the world, what do you believe that you're entitled to, and yeah, seeing if those are things that you really should feel entitled to, like your personal safety, for instance, or those are things that maybe you can take a step away from. So I guess those would be some questions I'd ask, along with some answers. I'm still improving and trying to get better at it.
No, that was really, really great. Marik, I had such a great time chatting, man. I really, I'd love to have you on again sometime. I think, there's a lot that we could like pick up and move forward. And I think I'll come better prepared to also bring those things forward with you, because you did a lot of the legwork today. But thank you so much. And everyone who tuned in, thank you so much for tuning in. Hit the subscribe button if you want to hear more. And thank you for grabbing the reins.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Eric. Really appreciate it. Peace.
You got it.